Yeah. So I sent you along this nice little article where Mr. Gene Simmons of Kiss says rock is dead. And it is kind of a weird quote. I wanted to see what your opinion was, but we'll read the quote real quick first. And this is Gene Simmons of Kiss, and I quote, "Rock is dead. And that's because new bands haven't taken the time to create glamour, excitement, and epic stuff. I mean, Foo Fighters is a terrific band, but that's a 20-year-old band. So you can go back to 1958 until 1988. That's 30 years. During that time, we had Elvis, the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Rolling Stones, on and on." And so that was his quote, end quote, I should say. And basically, he does say rock is dead pretty straight on within that quote. But I do find his argument a little odd, and I want to just kind of grab your thoughts first.
I think this is a good case of old man yells at clouds.
Yeah, just a guy yelling at a squirrel in a park. You know, he's like,
right, get off
nuts.
my lawn.
Yeah.
I think that's what it is, because rock is definitely not dead, but it's definitely different. And that's, to me, I think the big takeaway that I get is he's complaining, oh, it's dead, it's not the same, it's but that's every person once they get old. It's like, oh, things are so different now. It was better in my day, So he's just now being that old man that was probably yelling about his music when they were in their 20s, wearing makeup and doing things no band was doing. But the old people then were like, this is a monstrosity. These are devil worshippers who are praising Satan and eating children. Like, that's probably what they were saying about Kiss in the 70s. And now he's doing the very same thing, but just about what's happening today.
Oh, pretty much. Yeah. Those people, even the Elvis Presley people hated the Beatles so much, and that was only like 7 years apart, which is kind of crazy. But you look at that, I think you're right on that last point. For me, I look at it as, I don't think Gene is incorrect, but I don't think that's the argument. It's not about being correct or incorrect here. I think it's more about, is he more valid or invalid in his observation here? And I want to go back to that opening line again, not the rock is dead, but he goes, and I quote, "And that's because new bands haven't taken the time to create glamour, excitement, and epic stuff." End quote. I think that part he's a little more valid in saying that during his period, during his rock and roll stretch, that's kind of what rock and roll was. And so I agree with you. He's just an old person that during his time, it was a little bit different. It was true mainstream stuff. Now you have true pop stars and more R&B stars kind of like getting it to the tops. And you know what, it's going to be the Adeles, it's going to be the Beyoncés, it's going to be probably John Legend, Jay-Z, a lot of these lots of artists that are making the scene now, and it just happens not to be rock and roll. And so I want to go to one of the lines in the article where Alice Cooper, I think, said it best. And he differs from Gene Simmons, pretty much calling Gene Simmons a businessman, which I totally agree, and I'll get to in a second. But Alice Cooper basically said this, and I quote, "I guarantee you right now that in London somewhere, in garages, they're learning Aerosmith and Guns N' Roses. It's the same with the United States. There's all these young bands that want to resurge that whole area of hard rock. We're not at the Grammys, meaning rock and roll, rock stars. We're not in the mainstream, rock and roll, rock stars. Rock and roll is outside looking in right now, and that gives us the outlaw attitude." End quote. And I agree with Alice Cooper. I think the spirit of rock and roll is more or less still alive. It just it waned so much from those years of it just being beaten over the head in mainstream media that it really got washed away finally,
Yeah. That I would agree with. I would definitely agree. I think in the 90s we saw kind of the last time rock music was really at the forefront of culture, especially with grunge music. But even then, that was posited as like an alternative thing. Like there was still very much contemporary music. Hip hop was really starting to come into its own then and really start to kind of become mainstream. Pop music was always pop music. There's always going to be pop music, and that's always going to be your mainstream thing. But yeah, it's definitely changed, and it's maybe not as big, but there's a lot of bands that, when he said ended at 1988. Well, it's like, let's look what happened right after that. That's Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Rage Against the Machine, Foo Fighters. And yeah, that's right after 1988. But now we have the Black Keys, I think, are a great example. Jack White and the White Stripes. Like, there's still plenty of good rock music. Gary Clark Jr., like, you know, the list can go on and on of what good rock music is. It's maybe not what it was. It's certainly not as popular, but musically it might be better than it's ever been, even if it's not the flashy attitude. I think just the culture has changed. You know, people that are now our age who are just in that scene, we didn't have the same upbringing, so our attitudes and views of the world are just different. Whether you want to call it good or bad, that's a value judgment you can make, but it's just different, and doesn't mean the music's any worse. But yeah, there's not this fuck you attitude of rock and roll that there was, but I still say it's pretty damn good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I say, you know, you look at the people that you just mentioned, especially the Black Keys and Jack White coming from, you know, blue collar backgrounds, Gary Clark Jr. coming from blue collar background as well. Rock and roll is a very blue collar kind of. If you had to wear any collar, it'd be a blue collar one that goes with it.
Right.
And so I think that's where Gene is a little bit invalid in his observations of it, because rock is an attitude. And as much as I appreciate what he was saying, kind of like, well, you know, the best era of rock was from 58 to 88. I agree. I mean, that's a very strong period for rock and roll. That's
can't
probably
argue
the
that.
better period.
Yeah,
exactly. And so that's not bad. But then you still look at the artists that he named in his list: the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Rolling Stones, and Elvis. Those are also the early to mid aspects of it. And I think that today's mainstream just has a different attitude towards rock, not necessarily looking down on it, but just saying, well, there's other aspects of life that, you know, rock doesn't, you know, it just doesn't stick with certain people. And you know what? It does in certain areas. But that's where I think Josh Kiska, of the lead singer of Greta Van Fleet, came in with his opinion. Obviously, because they're also voyeurs of that classic rock sound, and maybe not necessarily the anarchist or the rebel attitude that much, other than in their music. But
right.
Josh stated in his retort was, and I quote, "Maybe the world of rock Gene remembers is dead. I don't know. I think rock and roll is very elastic genre. It's a very eclectic genre. It seems like every once in a while a generation reinterprets what that is. And I've heard a lot throughout the years, I guess, people blowing hot air about. I think rock and roll can become dormant, but you can't kill something that supersedes time." And so I kind of agree with what Josh said, and it really is just Gene, again, really spouting just from his own experience. And, you know, I don't find rock and roll to be glamorous and epic things. I find it to be a blue collar. It's a feeling. It's kind of like the blues has its own type of thing as well in comparison to what rock and roll has. But it also has that feel. It has that motion where it's not always going to fit into the mainstream. It is not guaranteed to be the best or the greatest.